The fork slipped from his hand first. Not dropped. Slipped. Like his fingers forgot what they were holding. It clattered against the plate, and the sound cut through the low hum of conversation at Wells' restaurant. A few heads turned. Not many. Just enough to notice the big man at the corner table suddenly gripping the edge of the wood like it might float away from him. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, Bumpy to everyone who mattered, sat perfectly still after that. His eyes were open. His chest was rising and falling, but slower now, like his body was reconsidering the whole arrangement. The woman across from him, a friend, maybe more, leaned forward and said his name. Once, then again louder. Her voice didn't shake yet. That would come later. Harlem in 1968 moved fast. News moved faster. By the time the ambulance arrived, people were already gathering outside Wells. Not crowding, not shouting, just standing, watching, waiting to see if the man who had walked these streets for 40 years, who had survived wars with the Italians, prison, betrayal, bullets, beatings, and his own worst instincts, was really about to lose to a plate of chicken and a quiet Tuesday night. He was 62 years old. He had outlived most of the men who came up with him. He had outlived the version of Harlem that made him. And now, in a restaurant that smelled like grease and cigarettes and coffee that had been sitting too long, his heart was deciding it had carried enough. But Harlem didn't believe it. Not the official story. Not the clean one. Not the one that said he died of a heart attack over dinner, natural causes, nothing to see here. File it away. Because Bumpy Johnson didn't do anything natural. He didn't live natural. He didn't move natural. And the people who knew him, who watched him, who feared him, or loved him, or both, they knew better than to think death would come for him like it came for everyone else. They said it was poison. They said it was a setup. They said the Italians finally got him, or the cops did, or someone he crossed 10 years ago, who never forgot. They said a lot of things, and none of them involved a heart that just gave out, because it was tired. Wells' restaurant sat on 7th Avenue, not far from the Apollo. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't a place you went to be seen. It was a place you went because the food was decent and the owner didn't ask questions. Bumpy liked it that way. He had spent too many years in places where everyone was watching, waiting for him to slip, to show weakness, to make a mistake. Wells was the opposite of that. It was quiet. It was his. He had been out of prison for 5 years by then. His last stretch, the one that took a decade, had aged him in ways the streets never did. When he went in, he was still Bumpy. Still the man who ran the numbers, who kept the Italians in check, who made sure Harlem stayed Harlem. When he came out, the city had changed. The heroin had come in harder. The young men were angrier, hungrier, less patient. They didn't remember what it was like before. They didn't care. Bumpy tried to adapt. He always did. That was how he survived. But adaptation has a cost, and he was paying it in pieces. His body hurt more than it used to. His sleep was thinner. The people he trusted were fewer, and the ones he didn't trust were everywhere. Still, he moved through Harlem like he always had. Not loud, not flashy, just present. A nod here, a conversation there, a favor done, a debt remembered. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. He had already done that. But he couldn't stop. Stopping meant disappearing. And disappearing meant losing the only thing that mattered: respect. The woman with him that night had known him for years. She wasn't family, not by blood. But she was someone he let sit across from him, without looking over his shoulder. The whole time. That meant something. She said later that he seemed fine. Tired, maybe. Quiet, but he was always quiet. He ordered the usual. He ate slowly. He didn't talk much, but that wasn't strange either. Bumpy Johnson never wasted words. And then the fork slipped. She thought at first he was joking. He had a dry sense of humor, the kind that didn't announce itself. But when she looked at his face, she saw something she had never seen before. Not fear, not panic, just distance. Like he was already somewhere else, and his body hadn't caught up yet. She called for help. The staff moved fast. Someone ran to the phone. Someone else cleared a space. A waiter who had seen men collapse before, this was Harlem after all, loosened Bumpy's collar and checked for breath. It was there, but barely. His eyes were open, but they weren't seeing. Outside, the word spread like smoke. Bumpy's down. Bumpy's at Wells. Bumpy's dying. People came. Not in a rush, but in a steady flow. They stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, faces hard. Nobody cried. Not yet. Crying was for after. This was the waiting part. The part where you stand witness, where you show up, where you make sure the man knows he didn't go alone. The ambulance took him to Harlem Hospital, the same hospital where so many others had gone before him, some because of him, some in spite of him. The doctors worked. They always did. But Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was declared dead within the hour. Heart attack. Myocardial infarction. The kind of thing that happened to men his age, especially men who lived the kind of life he lived. The police filed the report. The hospital released the body. The funeral home made the arrangements. And Harlem said no. Not out loud. Not in any official way. But in the barbershops, in the bars, in the apartments where people gathered after dark, the story changed. It twisted. It deepened. Because the idea that Bumpy Johnson, the man who had dodged death 100 times, who had walked out of ambushes and prison cells and betrayals that should have ended him, just dropped dead over dinner, that didn't sit right. Someone said they saw 2 men leave Wells right after Bumpy collapsed. Someone else said those men were Italian. Another person said they were cops. A woman who lived above the restaurant swore she heard arguing earlier that day. Loud voices. A door slamming. A numbers runner said Bumpy had been asking questions the week before. The kind of questions that made people nervous. A bartender said he seemed distracted, like his mind was somewhere else, like he was expecting something. None of it was proof. All of it was belief, because Harlem needed the story to be darker. It needed the death to match the life. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a man who went quietly. He wasn't a man who surrendered. And a heart attack, natural and ordinary and medical, felt like surrender. It felt small. It felt wrong. So the rumors grew. Poison in the food. A slow-acting agent slipped into his drink days before. A favor called in by someone powerful, someone untouchable. An old enemy finally patient enough to wait. The theories didn't need to be true. They just needed to make sense in a world where nothing else did. The funeral was massive. Thousands came. The church overflowed. The streets outside were packed with people who couldn't get in but refused to leave. They stood in silence as the casket was carried out. Some touched it as it passed. Just a hand on the wood. A goodbye that didn't need words. The eulogies were careful. They talked about his strength, his intelligence, his love for Harlem. They didn't talk about the violence. They didn't talk about the fear. But everyone in that room knew. You don't mourn a man like Bumpy without acknowledging what he was. And what he was, to Harlem, was protection. Complicated, flawed, sometimes brutal protection, but protection nonetheless. He kept the Italians from taking over completely. He kept the police from running wild. He kept Harlem black when everything around it was pushing toward erasure. He wasn't a hero. He was a necessity. And now, he was gone. The official story never changed. Heart attack. Natural causes. Case closed. But the darker truth, the one Harlem held on to, wasn't about facts. It was about meaning. It was about refusing to let the man be reduced to a medical report, a statistic, a footnote in someone else's history. Because if Bumpy Johnson just died of a heart attack, then what was it all for? The wars, the prison time, the broken bones, the enemies, the fear, the respect, all of it leading to a fork slipping from his hand in a quiet restaurant on a Tuesday night? That wasn't an ending. That was an insult. So Harlem wrote its own ending. One where Bumpy was still dangerous enough to be worth killing. One where his death mattered as much as his life. One where the man who built an empire on fear and loyalty and cunning didn't just fade away because his body gave out. He was taken. Deliberately. Carefully. By people who knew they couldn't beat him any other way. It didn't matter if it was true. It mattered that it felt true. Because the truth in Harlem was never just about what happened. It was about what it meant. And Bumpy Johnson dying quietly, alone, without a fight, without a final word, without one last move, that didn't mean anything. It didn't honor the man. It didn't honor the people who depended on him, who feared him, who shaped their lives around his presence. So they gave him a different death, a darker one, a death that matched the legend. And in doing so, they kept him alive. Not in the way ghost stories keep people alive. Not in the way myths do. But in the way memory works, when it refuses to be neat, when it refuses to be simple, when it insists that the people we lose were too big, too complicated, too important to be reduced to a single moment. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was buried. But the questions weren't. The official report was filed, but the whispers weren't. The restaurant kept serving food, the hospital kept treating patients, the city kept moving. But Harlem didn't forget. It didn't move on. It held on to the story it needed, the one that made sense of a life that was never going to fit into a clean narrative. And maybe that was the point. Maybe the truth was never going to be enough. Not for a man like Bumpy. Not for a place like Harlem. Not for a life that was built on the understanding that survival meant more than just breathing. It meant mattering. It meant being remembered not for how you died, but for what you were when you were alive. The fork slipped. The heart stopped. The body went cold, but the story stayed warm. It stayed alive. It stayed in the streets, in the conversations, in the careful way people said his name years later, like saying it wrong might wake something up. Harlem said the truth was darker. And maybe it was. Or maybe the truth was just that some people are too large to die quietly, too complicated to be summed up by a doctor's note, too necessary to be forgotten just because their heart gave out. Bumpy Johnson died at Wells' restaurant. That much is certain. Everything else is what Harlem decided it needed to be. And in the end, that's the only truth that mattered.